Okay, so for this section, we're going to begin to look at cell organization, how cells are structured, how they function. And for this lecture, we're going to look specifically at the cell membrane and what makes a cell membrane unique, how it functions, and literally the importance of it in numerous other parts of this class we're going to talk about. So this is just a general structure of a cell. Again, this is not every cell in the body. In fact, I doubt there's a cell that looks exactly like this. But a lot of these structures, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, from the nucleus, plasma membrane, ribosomes, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, all are going to play a role in various different types of cells. They're going to play key functions. And these organelles we'll go through a little bit more in depth one by one and walk through what these exactly are. But for today, I want to walk through the cell membrane and its role, why it's important. And so there's a couple of videos on Canvas for you can take a look at that talk about cell membranes and plasma membranes and how they function. And so today I'm just going to go through the basics of it. So right here we have a picture of what we generally consider a cell membrane or plasma membrane. And again, these will look different depending on the type of cell we're talking about, but generally we're looking at a membrane with human cells. It's typically a phospholipid bilayer. So in other words, there are phospholipids here. They have a polar and a non-polar side, and that's key because we have our polar side, which is hydrophilic. It likes water. We have our non-polar side, which is hydrophobic. It doesn't like water. And these ends will typically combine in this fashion, and it gives us this phospholipid bilayer. Now, commonly this structure is called a liquid mosaic model. The idea being that this membrane often isn't rigid. In fact, there's fluid moving through here. It's a very fluid membrane. And it's kind of a good analogy because many types of cells do need to have alterations in their structure. They need to not be rigid, and there needs to be movement inside this membrane. Muscle cells are common ones. Skin cells are a common example of the ones that have some type of fluid in them. Another key thing to understand with this is that inside this plasma membrane there are a lot of other structures. Proteins being very common, some that cross along the whole phospholipid bilayer, others acting as protein channels. We also have proteins which have carbohydrate attached to them called glycoproteins. Right here, these are often in the form of signals that the cell has on it that says, hey, I belong to this person, I'm human, don't kill me. And that's key because we have immune cells that if it didn't see that signal would attempt to kill that cell. We also have some cholesterol in here, which helps maintain the integrity of these cells. And so we have a lot of things here inside this phospholipid bilayer, this cell membrane, on top of just the phospholipids. And these structures play an unbelievable role in how this membrane is going to function. And maybe the best way to think about this is to think of a membrane as doors and windows to your house, where these have specific functions. They are going to let some things in when you want them to, and they're going to let some things not in. And sometimes there are things that are permeable that you allow in this house. There's things maybe you don't want to allow in the house. And these proteins, these channels, and this membrane allows for that to happen. So there's certain things, for example, like gases. Generally, O2 and CO2 are permeable. They can diffuse right through this membrane. They're small enough, they don't have a charge, which is important. And because this membrane is charged, these don't have a charge, they can get through. Other larger things like glucose can't just diffuse through the membrane. It has to come through a protein channel. Other things like some types of hormones, steroid hormones, they're going to need other proteins channels to help them influence and get into this cell. And so that's going to become important because the membrane often defines how cells function. If you want a cell to take up glucose, it needs to have the receptors for insulin or to do that. If it doesn't have those receptors, those proteins on the cell membrane, it's not going to do that. If you want your muscle cell to function to contract, and you want epinephrine, which is a hormone, to signal that, you need receptors, proteins, on the membrane for that. And so these channels, these proteins, are going to play key functions. These proteins can also act as enzymes. We actually see this in places like the small intestine, where there's numerous enzymes both in the lumen of the small intestine as well as on the small intestine, the mucosal cell membrane itself, that act as enzymes that'll catalyze reactions, that'll cause breakdown of other, might be carbohydrates, might be other proteins. These are going to play really key roles. And then there's some of these proteins that are going to act as cell identity markers. In other words, identifying those cells as human or having specific characteristics. We see this in the immune system all the time. One of these proteins, for example, is something called CD4. And CD4 is a marker that's on cells that identifies those cells as you. And so when T cells come upon your cells, they recognize it as you and don't try to kill it. However, if those markers aren't there, or if there's something wrong with those markers, or there's an incorrect response to those markers or those proteins, you can imagine there'd be a problem. And so this cell membrane, this plasma membrane, is going to play a lot of key function. Not just as much as letting compounds, molecules, gases in and out. It's also going to play a role because of what it's called the membrane potential. And we're going to talk a ton about this when it comes to neurons, when it comes to muscle cells, because another key thing that occurs at this plasma membrane or cell membrane is depolarization. And this is where we see a change in charge from the inside of the membrane to the outside of the membrane. Like I said, we'll go much more in depth in this, but cells typically have a charge, and typically the charge inside the cell is going to be more negative than the charge outside the cell. And this is because there's typically more negative ions inside. Typically there's more sodium on the outside, which is positively charged. There's proteins on the inside, which are negatively charged. And generally we say that the cell membrane typically has a more negative charge, and that's at rest. However, there will be events that occur, and we'll talk about what those are as we go on in the next few chapters, that may cause this membrane to depolarize. In other words, channels open up through this plasma membrane, causing positive charges to come in, negative charges to leave, and it'll cause this charge to flip, to depolarize. And this actually will signal the cell to do things like cause actin and myosin to contract in muscle, causing muscle cells to contract. This will cause messages to be sent down neurons to tell your brain, hey, there is something touching your toe. All of these depolarizations play a key role in how cells relate to, communicate, or conduct whatever function it is they need to do. So we'll get more into this as far as depolarization, what that is. You'll know more about that, especially when we talk about the nervous system, than you probably want to know. But these are maintained. This potential is maintained by proteins. There are proteins that keep sodium out. There are proteins that keep potassium and chloride and these proteins in. And they're kind of like gatekeepers in a way. And so these channels, sometimes they're called pumps, keep this membrane potential normal or at a resting state until something causes a depolarization to occur. Okay, so that's pretty good as far as this. The next lecture we're going to go into some of these organelles, the nucleus, the cytoplasm, some of these other key organelles in the animal cell.